Okay, good afternoon. I am Anto Budiarjo. Welcome to Monday Live. This is something that we do every Monday at 3 o'clock Eastern to try and figure out the future of smart buildings. So panelists are listed on Monday Live if you need to know who we are. Just as a reminder that views expressed here are personal, not of any company or organization. Please do post questions, comments on the Zoom tools. I think you know how to do that by now. And if you can complete the survey at the end, you get an email. That would be great. And this deck that I'm showing is also on mondaylive.org if you want to see any of the links. So just as a reminder, this month's overall sort of topic is sustainability. And this is the agenda for today. We'll have a chit chat for 10 minutes or so on what's going on. And then we'll talk about sustainability. And today we're going to be talking about that in the context of smart cities. We have Phil Bane from Smart Cities Council, and I'm sure that'll be a really interesting conversation. Hopefully there'll be lots of questions and comments and discussion. So Ken Sinclair put this up. Talking about March and April issue. We'll get an opportunity to hear from him in a minute. John Petsy talking about is this up to date or was this last week's?
No, this is this week's brand new stories, both of them pretty quick,
Okay.
yeah.
Great. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Mark talking about buildings being an ally in climate change. That'll be a great conversation. I've been sort of tracking the Department of Energy and watching what the new secretary is talking about, and also I notice the lawsuits are now starting to come regarding Texas. So that's another thing that I find quite interesting to track. And Therese, I think this was from last week, but we're still in what is it this month? Women's Month? Oh, what is the right name for it? Because
It was Women's Day.
it was Women's Day last Monday, but I think the whole month is anyway. So and I think Roger is this is from last week as well. I'm sorry about that. So I'll bring back the crew.
You didn't put mine up.
You had one?
I did.
You did. I'm sorry, you were probably late.
It was a bit of a downer.
Okay, so maybe you can talk about it anyway. So Ken, do you want to?
Thanks. Okay, good. So yesterday I was at the Church of Control Trends, and we did a little bit of a chat talking about our March issue, and we talked a little bit about Gina. So she'll have to listen to it because her ears will be burning. She's going to be on their show coming up as well. So that was good. We did a little bit of an introduction to our April issue, which is going to be adaptation, and we now have our article online about that. And I think that's a good fit with the sustainability theme of Monday Live. So this the whole way that we best exist is that we adapt. We learn all this stuff and we just keep learning and relearning. But ultimately, how we adapt to what it is we learn is really the result. So I'm going to start pushing that in our April issue. Want you all to chime in. Another one that got shared actually by my youngest daughter is the Google new career certificates could disrupt college degrees. I think we're starting to see the fragmentation of education. I think that's kind of an interesting trend. I think the COVID has basically raised a lot of questions about the value of the universities and the value of having componentized, maybe that's not quite the right word, pieces of education. And if some of that can get quantified and qualified, that could radically change our industry. And I think we're seeing more and more of that in our industry, that folks are offering online education, and everybody has such a different approach that they have to create a YouTube to basically explain what they're doing. So that's kind of a trend.
So Ken, let me ask you about that. Could we all maybe even potentially agree that there needs to be a radical tectonic shift in how we view, maybe this is an American thing, I don't know about Canada, how we view education as almost a non-starter. If you don't have a 4-year degree, you're kind of done and you're relegated to some other thing. Or if we could create programs like you mentioned that are more, I don't know, compartmentalized or something, where you can bite off and chew what you need to chew to continue to grow in your world. I think that's a fabulous move forward.
Well, I think it falls into the sustainability theme, and if you start reading the adaption article I wrote, is that basically we've learned so much, we're almost immobilized, and we keep learning more and more, and we can't learn everything because it's just everything we touch is another technology, another even another industry. We keep crossing over into other industries as well. What we have to do is we have to kind of shake our head and just say, what of this are we going to use, and how are we going to adapt to the changes that we do understand? And so more and more, the bigger question becomes is, go get a degree in what? We always used to say, did we want to have electrical engineers or mechanical engineers in the control industry? And now, do we want data scientists, or, it just keeps changing and changing. And the answer is yes, we want all of those. And I think the only way we can survive is adapt to the fact that we have to start pulling pieces of all of these that fall on our industry.
That's great.
So it's just some radical changes needed, and I think they're happening. We're starting to see that happening a lot all over. I think the universities are responding. Even they're starting to break their curriculums apart into componentized pieces.
Great.
Now, this comes on the heel of a story I saw this weekend that overall college enrollment continues to decline. So, and that is even true within the engineering disciplines. So,
great, John.
Yeah, two stories I think are interesting. First one is taking the pulse of what is being felt in commercial real estate, office market, tenants holding off long-term decisions on their leases and on fit out, those types of things. Still, glimmers of hope, but still in that mode of not spending, not signing, right? And that's what we've been watching for a year. But actually, you read it, but it's. I guess I took a little positive from it that it is coming around. All right, I'd maybe still be holding off too, but it's looking positive, right? The next one down there, Larry Fink, his letter to CEOs. We should mention who Larry Fink is. He's the CEO of BlackRock, okay? And BlackRock is just a small investment company, $8.6 trillion under management. And his letter this year is a belief that sustainability matters, that society is getting it, and that's where investments will be made. I think that's pretty compelling, because as we've shared our frustration over the year and years, that right until the C-suite and the financial suite takes notice of the types of things that our technology and our companies can bring to the world, we're not going to see dramatic difference in deployment and scaling and adoption. So I thought that was pretty compelling. It's worth reading that letter. They're a major player, supposedly the world's largest asset management company.
Great, thank you. But by the way, March is Women's History Month. That's what I was trying to think of. So over to you, Mark.
So I want to echo John's last statement first. I'm part of a group, ESG, and one of the things that came out was a lot of the major lending institutions have said that they are upping their lending practices in and around sustainability, and they're cutting back on some of the more traditional things over the years that they've done. But what I posted today, which again, I thought was interesting, it was a piece from Forbes. And when I start to see things in general business magazines that kind of catch my attention about our industry, I kind of perk up a little bit. The fact that it did not come from our industry standard type media, that this was general business, and what they talk about, and I encourage everybody to take a look at it, is that the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is a division or a group from the economists over in the UK, is anticipating that the global economy will suffer losses amounting to 7.9 trillion, that's with a T, by 2050 if we do not get our act together with respect to energy, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And the article goes on to say is that they are encouraging legislation because that encourages existing buildings to start to adopt energy saving programs and or things, technology, to make sure that ones that are being built start to have smart technologies in place as they are being built. And then finally, thing I got out of this was it is absolutely imperative in order for this to be successful that we have to implement this at scale now. We can't do it piecemeal. It's got to be at scale. So again, the fact that business media is saying that, I thought it was pretty good. They're picking up on this now.
Hey, Mark, can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
So a lot of what you said kind of sounds a little bit to me like, I don't know, 2008, 2010 type stuff. In your opinion, what do you think has kind of changed? It seems like we're coming around again. If you guys remember when we had the whole energy crisis right around the Great Recession, what do you think is different now? And why do you think you're seeing it in some of the regular business magazines?
I just think, one, the social impact has had a chance to really strengthen and build itself. And then two is, I think it goes along, again, what John has said, and we've talked about this whole movement from sustainability to ESG, environmental social governance. And so I think it's that whole new look. It's a whole new brand, so to speak. And people are getting there, are beginning to follow. And lastly, employees want to see that. They want to work for companies in general that are being socially and environmentally responsible.
Just to echo that, Gino, I think what Mark's saying last piece is generational change, right? And I think that's why the focus on ESG as opposed to the social aspect is a thing that's really important to generational change. And I think they're having an impact since the last 2008.
So, Anna, while you're speaking, I just found your slide. I just refreshed my page. So talk about Target to close city center operation.
Yeah, Target announced just this week or late last week. If you're not sure, don't know, but Target's head offices are in Minneapolis, of course. One of their big centers, one of their big locations was City Center, downtown Minneapolis, and they're going to close about 1 million square feet of that,
Wow.
relocating some 3,500 employees in the process, and they're going to what they call a hybrid system. They call flex for your day, which basically means, you want to work from home, you want to work from the office, it's up to you. But they're closing the city center. They still have a couple of other locations in Minneapolis. So if you want to work from the office, you'll be going to one of the other two locations. But that's the big deal is it's 1 million square feet in downtown Minneapolis, right? Which is a significant chunk of property.
Yeah, no kidding. That's huge.
Isn't Johnson pulling out of Minneapolis? Aren't they closing down the headquarters?
Wisconsin.
Oh, I didn't hear that one.
Wisconsin.
That's Milwaukee.
Milwaukee, sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
They're pulling out of there. All right.
Yeah.
Where are they going?
In the suburbs, I heard. Somewhere else.
Yeah, they're going with the same, from what I understand, the same flex type model. And then they also have an additional office somewhere in the suburbs of Milwaukee. So it's going to be the same type of work at home as well.
So Anno, when you say that 35,000 employees or whatever it was and all this,
3,500.
3,500 employees, you know what occurs to me, and it brought a little smile to my face. This does seem like the reaction to an unusual global situation. And I'm still remembering that employees are humans. And I'm just thinking 6 months or a year, 18 months from now, they're going to go, this was a shitstorm. Get your asses back to an office.
We shall see. We shall see.
I think Yahoo tried that a few years ago as well.
Yep.
You remember?
IBM was just bringing people back when the
Yeah.
when the pandemic hit. I don't know where they stand on things now.
Hey,
Well, the
Arno,
smart-
any idea what's going to happen to that 1 million square feet?
No, in fact, if you looked up the building, they've only got about 78,000 feet of leasable space. So it's a high occupancy building to begin with, right? It's already at less than 5% occupancy. So it's going to make a major dent. I guess to Bill's point, if you believe in Bill's plan, you should go lease that space for the next 2 years and wait for Target to come back and sell it at a premium.
All right. So with that, let's move on to our subject of the day, and I'm going to bring on Phil Bane to the panel. And so the subject is smart cities. So just by way of a bit of an introduction, Phil Bane runs Smart Cities Council, which is one of the organizations that's driving a lot of smart cities thinking. I've known Phil since the Smart Grid days, and so welcome, Phil, and really just sort of introduce yourself and sort of give us some sort of the lay of the land on smart cities. I know it's gone through some sort of ups and down over the past few years. Tell us where it's at and what you're expecting, and specifically on the sustainability angle.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, so I'm Phil Bane. I'm the Managing Director of Smart Cities Council. We've been around for about 10 years. Our primary purpose right now is to accelerate projects for cities. Generally in the developed world, a non-digital project takes about 4 years. In the developing world, it takes 10 to 15, or if you're lucky, to go sort of from concept to implementation. So the KPI in which we measure our success is, can we accelerate a city's implementation of a project? So a smart building project, a smart transportation project, projects with sustainability or resilience goals. And generally what we try to do is, we think the area where cities are losing a lot of time and a lot of effort is sort of in what we would call the initial scoping activities, where they're trying to figure out what their problems are, who should be at the table, whether generally sort of a big bucket, what kind of solutions should they have? And so we help them there. And our philosophy is that if we can accelerate a project, then the city wins, the resident wins, the solution providers win, the financiers win. And it's an area where there's just not been a lot of work. I mean, the biggest problem I see in organizations, which include cities, is converting knowledge to action. There's just not the capacity in most cities to do it, and they need help. So in terms of sustainability itself, our sort of mission statement has been the use of intelligent design and information technology to deliver livable, workable, sustainable cities. So generally in the literature, and I think the way most people have pursued it, is that sustainability is part of a triple P, or people, planet, and profits approach, where you focus on the needs of people, you focus on is the project or is a city or is anything financially sustainable over a period of time? Does it pay for itself? And then the classic definition of sustainability is, are you taking from the future to build the present? And that's really where energy comes in. Also, there's the concept of uncalculated costs. So like the biggest problem we've always had with energy consumption and most of what we do in the industrial world is that we've never taken into account the costs associated with pollution, bad health, and things like that. And of course, that's where a lot of it's changing. So in the smart city perspective, it really is geographically focused, if you want to talk about sustainability. And I'm somewhat cynical about it because I think there's a lot of greenwashing from financial institutions and industrial commercial institutions. But also, having grown up in India and Africa, I had the World Bank ask me at one time to help them put together a series of speeches about how African cities should contribute to climate mitigation. And I said I wouldn't do it, because the problem is that it was sort of this white privileged developed country approach towards you need to also participate in saving the planet when the rest of us have screwed it up already. And if you've lived in Africa or India or any in the developing world, you know that the problems are not whether tomorrow is going to be hotter than today or 10 years is going to be hotter. It's whether most people are day wagers, right? And so therefore they simply, do they get a job tomorrow? Can they get paid to have food tomorrow? And any of you that followed the COVID crisis in India know that the biggest problem with Prime Minister Modi's lockdown was not that wealthy people didn't have places to go and money in the bank. It was that 60% of the population in India are day wagers. And so therefore they had to go back to their homes and they didn't have any way of living. And this is sort of the problem with sustainability. It's easy for people who live in developed countries to sort of argue that those that live in developing countries should contribute to saving the planet. And there's just no motivation at a sort of day-to-day level in many of these places to do that. And of course, there's all sorts of policy objectives that one can go through. But from a city perspective, like I've dealt recently with Accra and Abuja, which is the capital of Nigeria. And the biggest, the problem in Accra was that they had a flooding problem that was caused by excess waste. And in every corner of the city, you had waste piling up because they didn't really have a good waste management system. In Abuja, the problem was public safety because there's a tremendous amount of kidnapping and crime around people who travel to and from work. So a lot of times the issues are somewhat different. Now, if you come into the United States, and we also have a significant presence in Australia, and there it's very different than it is here. There is a real focus on sustainability. But another thing, I'm surprised none of you brought it up, is that now almost hand in hand with the word sustainability is the word resilience. And somebody used the word adapting. I think it was maybe Ken earlier talked about adaption, which is really this idea about how do you adapt to cascading crises, which is really what cities are facing. So many of the cities that I've dealt with in the United States in the past year that they've dealt with COVID, they've also dealt with systematic racism, public safety, economic deprivation. You guys talked about education. That's a huge issue around workforce development. So no city gets the ability to sort of solve one problem at a time. I'm going to be the sustainable city. It's just not within the menu of options they have. So a lot of times they have to look at, can they be sustainable with an existing framework around a smart building project or a transportation project or a public safety project. And the goals, the worldwide goals around sustainability are expressed with the UN sustainability goals, the UN SDGs. And UN SDG 9 and 11 deal with sort of cities and urban environment. And I have yet to come across a city in the United States that talks about the UN SDGs. They just don't do it. And so they don't even use, the common framework that the rest of the world uses. So that's sort of how I see it. Generally, it doesn't mean that every project we don't focus on helping the city look at sustainability. A lot of times the question is, what's the benchmarking? So like we're starting with a huge project with Orange County. It's probably going to be the largest smart and healthy building project in the country. We're looking at 530 buildings for the county itself, and that doesn't include Orlando or the 10 other cities. And it's about a six-month project where we're doing this initial, first 30 to 40% of the project scoping. And they are looking at sustainability, and they're looking at within the building context. They're calling it smart and healthy buildings. But honestly, that's somewhat an unusual approach. How's that, Anto, for a beginning?
It's a great start. Yeah, to the group.
So Phil, Mark Peacock here. So my question for you is, and you kind of ended it on what you just presented. Thank you very much. Is this, so of all the components or buckets that truly make up a smart city, infrastructure, buildings, transportation, outdoor lighting, whatever, just add to the list. Where have you seen buildings? In other words, when people start conversations and continue conversations about smart cities, where do buildings kind of fall in what you've seen, your experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. As many of you know, it really depends upon the building stock or inventory of the city. So like I live in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is a somewhat bluer area, progressive, sustainable area in a purple state now. And I'm part of a nonprofit here that Faith Alliance for Climate Mitigation. And we've probably been working for 15 years with the county to do something about sustainable buildings. And frankly, they've just never listened to us. They've never been interested. Generally, most cities are going to go after traffic before they go after buildings. Because if you think about it, there's actually, most cities, the biggest contributor to carbon emissions is traffic and congestion. And so it really depends on their stock, the age of it. But I have to say, and I didn't get into this, but sort of the way we work with cities is we do a quarterly challenge where we have cities give us data. And so like we just finished the fourth quarter of last year with 40 projects from around the world. And I have to say, in the United States, we had 30 projects and every city had a smart building project. So I can say that. So Colorado Springs, Palmdale, Omaha, who else? Morrisville, Orange County, they all had smart buildings. So I do think they're starting to look at buildings as something they can control. And so therefore something that maybe they can do something about.
So who funded it though? Was that from the private sector or was that from the city sector, the government or whatever, as far as these smart buildings that you just
Right. Well, now all of the projects that we're dealing with is, as I would say, are in the pre-procurement stage. Okay. So part of what we're trying to do is figure out how, in fact, they could be paid for. And one of the reasons Orange County sort of got on the bandwagon with the challenge in the fourth quarter was because they wanted to be ready for climate funds from the Biden administration. They were actually one of the few cities that would really see that, as an opportunity, and they wanted to be prepared. But generally, most of them are going to pay it out of capital funds, bonds, stuff like that. But again, it depends. I mean, if it's an operating, let's say it's maintenance or it's changing the HVAC, a big issue right now in buildings, and every one of the projects we saw dealt with ventilation. And so that may be a much more current need that has to be funded out of current funds.
So Philip, Steve Fay here. From the Smart City Council, that what, be a little more precise if you could, on your definition of sustainability. That's our topic for the month. And from your perspective, what does that word mean? Because we're really struggling with the current definition.
Yeah, I mean, generally, I've used the 100 Resilient Cities Rockefeller Foundation for sustainability, which frankly, I can't remember off the top of my head. I get nailed all the time, everywhere I go, about the lack of a definition for smart cities. And people will make a big deal about it. And I just don't get caught in that trap. And I would suggest the same thing with sustainability. I mean, the easiest definition I have is you're not stealing from the future. is, and you're using your resources wisely, which in different situations can mean different things. Especially with different communities. Well, whatever. So just different communities have different definitions of sustainability. Where I see it really going that's interesting, and again, this ties in with resiliency, and there is technology that really is starting to come to the fore, is most of our focus in cities is on the built infrastructure, transportation, things that we can build and touch and manage. Where we don't have a focus is on the human beings who experience the city. And this is now, we're working with several companies, one out of Australia, one out of the United States. I've been working on this for about 5 years, which is how can you measure the experience of people themselves, in terms of their commute or public safety or education or any number of things. We did a big project 5 years ago around what was the happiest city in the United States. And we did an extensive data dive, and we decided not to publish it because we did have a happy city and we did have a very unhappy city. And we just decided that it was antithetical to our goal, which is to help cities. And I don't believe in lists, but to go to your question just simply is I just think you don't get caught up. Now, you have to be careful, obviously, because there are people who are going to mislabel and say what they're doing is sustainable. And I think you then have to go to some definition like, 100 Resilient Cities. But, they spent $97 million and had nothing to show for it. So I'm not sure their definition even worked. Thanks for the question, Steve.
No, thank you, Phil.
Hey,
So,
Phil, let me ask one question for Phil. Hey, Phil, Bill
Go ahead.
Bain down here in Atlanta. Thank you. We're seeing, our company's seeing all over the world. I'm not sure if there's a question here or a statement, or I'd love to hear your interaction, your thoughts on this. We see all of the integrators and people on the calls like this, whether it's traffic, buildings, water and wastewater, video, creating systems and integrations that make cities smarter, just like, but in a disconnected fashion. All right. So cities are getting smarter. Bear with me on this. Let me try to see if I can put something together for you. Cities are getting smarter, one integration at a time. I'm wondering, is it not a smart city until leadership decides we're going to integrate all of these little itty bitty iterative smarter city approaches into one? Like, when does it become a smart city? Curiosity.
I mean, that's a great question, actually. All of you have experience with buildings, and my experience, and I'm not an expert on any of this, is that, part of what happens in the building environment is you have individual use cases, right? So you have a use case around CCTV, you'll have a use case around temperature control and occupancy, you'll have a use case around ventilation. And I did this in Dubai one time, I couldn't believe it, where we were looking at a bunch of buildings, and essentially we had 6 different vendors, right? From Hitachi to Siemens to Schneider to you name it. And every one of them had their own use case. And so therefore they had their own data schemas, their own syntax, and, and people were sitting there going, how do we integrate this? Okay. And of course, every vendor was saying, well, you do it through our platform. And this has really become the problem. And I think I can talk to you guys about this because of your experience in buildings. The number one problem we've had in the smart city space has been vendors trying to flog platforms. It's our platform, and any of you are familiar with the Kansas City procurement that started, and you had 7 bidders, each spending over $1 million getting ready for it. And then halfway through the procurement was issued, Kansas City pulls it out, and it was a platform approach. And that was about 18 months ago, and it really hit the market in terms of, commercial solution providers being willing to participate, because they could justify the $1 million if they lost, but they couldn't justify the $1 million if nobody won. And so, it was a real problem. But going to your question, Bill, in terms of cities, I'll share this with Anto, and we're doing a big project with Nashville around urban flooding. And it's urban, and I really want to focus on the last clause. It's mitigating the impact of urban flooding on vulnerable populations. And that goes to the point I was talking about the human experience of urban flooding. Urban flooding kills more people and causes more damage in the United States than any other disaster. But we don't focus on the human experience. We focus on levees and infrastructure and watersheds and all that kind of stuff and buyouts, and we don't focus on the human experience. And it's very much like an occupant's experience in a building. You know, now we're really starting to focus on that and from a building perspective, and it's the same with the cities. So every vendor wants to sell their own platform. Our big motto is, along with everybody winning, is that let's listen to other cities. So when Nashville, right now we heard Savannah, Charlotte, Cary, Cleveland, they all came in and gave their different presentations about what kind of solutions they were using. And the one that really resonated with Nashville was Cary. Cary won an award, IDC award 2 years ago on their smart water stuff. And they had this bombshell slide about their architecture. And their architecture showed 6 different vendors: Salesforce, SaaS, Azure, I can't remember who the other ones were, but they had like 6 different vendors. And what they had done is taken the time, per your point, Bill, to integrate all of those different vendors into the solution. And everybody was marveling over the slide because, and the guy who talked about it, he's since retired, was, hey, you guys, don't let anybody sell you a platform. This is what you do. You take the different solutions. And so like they were using some sets of platforms. They had Dell Boomi in there to integrate the data. And then they had others, and it's sensor based. So it's very much like what you would do in a building. And then they had SaaS for analytics. And then they had Salesforce for messaging to citizens, you know, getting the message out and getting it to them. And it was really fascinating, and everybody, and it really resonated with the cities because it meant that they controlled their future. You know, they were able to work with different solution providers. Now, if I may riff off of that for a second, Bill, where this is really going. And I did an interview last week with Scripps, and supposedly it's supposed to be shown on 50 TV markets this week or something. And then I did an interview. I was giving some coaching to a candidate here in Virginia who's running for mayor. And I was telling them that the real focus should be on data governance. So if any of you are familiar with San Diego, they had a huge problem with public surveillance. And it was really around 2 issues. One, it goes to the use case issue, which we talked about at the beginning, because they had Public Works put in the cameras so that they could help with parking. Police found out about it, and guess what? They added a new use case, which was, I'm going to surveil everybody on the street. And the problem for San Diego was they had no data governance framework. They had no ability to figure out how to share data, how to share private data, public data, who could use it, when they could use it. And I've written an article about this, about Virginia. Virginia actually published a COVID dashboard in 1 week. And they integrated both private and public data. And it was all because they had a data sharing framework that they had put into place 3 years before then. So everything you're saying about buildings is exactly what's happening in cities. You have multiple use cases, you have multiple vendors. And this is where and this is what I was telling this candidate running for mayor. I said, look, you only use technology when it's appropriate. And then when you use it, you have a framework to govern it. Those are, we talked for an hour, and I said, if there's only 2 things you remember from me, it's you use technology when it's appropriate and you have a framework to govern it.
Thank you.
Incidentally, somebody posted a comment wondering if you would share who the happiest city is. You probably won't want to do that. So
no, I'll tell you that the 5 cities we was New York, DC, Philadelphia, Houston, Chicago, and LA, the 5 largest cities plus. And we analyzed for 3 years all the digital media, social media, everything. And this was being done by a contractor that had been working for the CIA. So they had some really intricate algorithms, and they use it in diplomacy. And I've always been opposed to smart city rankings because I just think they're antithetical to us. We're either in this together or we're not. Cities are all very competitive. So we know, like, for instance, when I was speaking in Sydney one year, I talked about how Melbourne was the #1 city in the world, just to rile them, not because it was something I like to talk about, but yeah, so cities want to know who's #1, and I always sort of don't answer that question. It's just like not getting caught up in the definition of what's smart. You could spend days and years doing that. And for me, it's not about technology, it's about people. And you're smarter today than you were yesterday. And, Rome was a smart city in 1 AD because it knew how to move water and waste. And today we just have different definitions of what smart would be.
So Phil, you mentioned a couple of those things. So what's your view on political? In other words, we say it's for the citizens, for the residents. Couldn't agree with you more. And again, I think we've seen that work in places like Dubai and a few other places where the true smart city concept has been around for a long time. In your dealings, talk a little bit about the political side. I'm a mayor of Richmond, Virginia. I live in Virginia, by the way, Phil. And, hey, I'm going to make my city smart. I'm going to put that on my platform. So be it. So what's your thoughts?
Yeah, we could have another discussion about Dubai, but I'll leave that for the moment. So I'll tell you what I told this mayoral candidate today, and that was that there are a lot of sort of rules of the road that when we started the smart city sort of movement 10 years ago that we used. Like, one of them was think big, start small. Another was have a champion, which is your point, have a champion. And I've gotten to the point now where I don't believe in either one. I hate pilots. I hate living labs. I hate paper. Those are the 3 things that if people come to me, and usually a mayor will come to me and say, hey, we're going to do a living lab, or we're going to do a pilot. And I'll say, that's waterfall methodology. It's good for a public, press release. It's not going to get you to a smart city. So the second thing, so that this whole idea about think big and start small, what happens is all the cities start small and they stay small. And that's just a fact of life. The other thing is you need a champion. And, as a former military officer, somebody who's taken a company public, I've always sort of, understood the value of leadership. But for any of you that have ever had a history class, you've probably at one time or another had to answer the question, is history made up of, leaders? Do we have Waterloo because of Napoleon, or was that time of Europe based on some other social trend, right? And I've gotten to the point now where, for instance, we're working with Nashville. They've had 6 mayors in 5 years. Barcelona, any of you who know that they got a great ranking as a smart city, then they had a new mayor and they lost it. Same thing has happened in Paris. So I've really moved away from the idea of politicians being leaders. And what I've started to focus on is, I think the 2 things that are going to change cities going into the future are data and finance. And if you have a systems view of cities, that it's part of an ecosystem, those are the 2 levers that if you're trying to change a city, you're going to change it by how you use data, how you generate it, and how you collect it, and how you analyze it. And then the other thing that you're going to change is how you finance your operations. And any of you that live in the United States and have had to put up with, the US tax code and understand that we do a tremendous amount of social engineering around our tax code. And you mentioned ESG when you guys started. That's really the future that's going to change. If you want African cities to become sustainable, you put strict requirements on how they spend money. And I'll give you an example of this. So you're all many of you are probably familiar with how China spends money around the world. They're the biggest lender in Africa. So I used to live in Kenya, and there's a beautiful port up in the northwest of Kenya called Lamu, L-A-M-U. Dhows come out of it. It's just a beautiful, gorgeous place. But small, not very big. I mean, the size of, well, not, you know, maybe 20,000 people. So the Chinese came in and they said, we're going to build a port here because you need a port in northern East Africa on the border of Somalia and Eritrea. And we're gonna pay to build that port. Now, of course, they did the same thing in Sri Lanka. They did the same thing in several other places, Pakistan included. But they funded a coal power energy. Okay, so imagine if some Western World Bank, African Development Bank came along and said, "Okay, we'll fund the same port, but you have to use renewable energy, and you know you're going to do it with sun, you're going to do it with wind, you're going to do whatever." So to me, data, or data as we would say in Australia, and finance are the two things that are going to make our cities sustainable.
Hey, Phil, this is Arno. I do a lot of work in the APAC market region as well. And there's a lot of push of smart cities there. One of the terms that they use often that I come across is something they call the user's digital journey. Have you heard that? They kind of use it to describe what does all this data mean and how is an actual end user going to use it in the context of the smart city? Have you heard that term much at all?
You know, I haven't heard that term, and we've done a good amount of work in that area. We have representatives in Singapore, and of course you have ASEAN and smart cities. I've done a lot of work in Korea. I haven't heard that framing of it. Of course, the word, you know, UX, the user experience, is really important. But I do think it's a key concept. I mean, I haven't heard that particular expression of it, but as a concept,
yeah, it's come around probably in the last 6 or 12 months there, and we've done a couple of initiatives there. And it's yeah, they call it the user digital journey, and it describes, you know, what's the whole user experience from the moment he gets up at home, in his apartment, to the bus, you know, to the mass rapid transport, to, you know, going to his building, ordering lunch, you know, the whole experience and how it's all wrapped around. They're obviously highly mobile focused spaces, you know.
Yeah, it's a fascinating.
How does that data?
No, it's a fascinating concept. I mean, Carlo Ratti has a very good article in any of you that may get it, FDI magazine, Foreign Direct Investment magazine, and it's all about the user experience vis-a-vis the streetscape and the building. Right. And you know, many of us know that the common approach in terms of zoning is to put retail on the first floor, right? Now, if you go to Korea or anywhere in Asia, the retail will go up to the 6th floor, but you know, but it's accessible. So what are you going to do, right, when people aren't traveling into the inner city or the central part, and they don't have that user experience of retail where they can pop in and, you know, buy a CD-ROM or whatever they're buying, a coffee. And it's fascinating how COVID's going to change that user experience. That to me is one of the most, I mean, a lot of people focus on working from home and you know, I think we're moving away from single purpose buildings. But the thing that's really interesting is, and I think this would tie into what you said, Anna, is the idea of really, how do you spend your time? You know, right. How is your time used or consumed by either digital or non-digital? And of course, from my perspective, and one of the things you have to be really careful of when you're dealing in many cities is, especially in the United States, you got to understand the digital divide, and you got to understand that the user experience may not be digital at all. So that's one of the things we're exploring in Nashville, where we recognize that one of the vulnerable populations were renters that were living along the Cumberland River, but they never got any notices because only the owners of the buildings got the notices. And so, you know, and how do you, I mean, we all see it with COVID right now. I don't know about any of you, but, you know, I've had to help people in my family and other people get registered because they don't either know or have access to digital registration. So it's an interesting situation.
Hi, Philip. This is Gina, and I had a question for you. Do you think that you could correlate smart cities to healthy cities? And if you could do that, would that be a driver?
So, excellent question. I'll focus, if you don't mind, on the word could. Yes, you could correlate a smart city to certain types of outcomes. Whether, in fact, cities will or do, I think is a whole nother issue. And the aspect of it too is, would you be talking about transportation? So like there are programs in many cities in the United States now, and I get it confused with zero waste, which is a climate mitigation, but it's zero deaths, zero pedestrian deaths from traffic. I can't remember, zero something. And so does that make a city healthy if you reduce pedestrian deaths, right? What are the other metrics that you would use? Would it be, lifespan? Would it be,
Yes.
Things like that?
Lack of diseases, lack of, say if you see, even if you could monitor lack of impact of COVID or some other type of that. I mean, if you could, and of course, I mean, we're a population that likes to move around a lot in the United States, but if you could measure that on lifespan, lack of certain types of diseases that may be associated with environmental causes, and of course, everything else being equal. But it seems to me it would be a long-term study, but very, very feasible, very viable.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on the premise, okay? I have a couple of observations. One is that, the longitudinal aspect of the survey would be difficult because cities change and you have different crises. So, if you look at any kind of map right now, the effect of climate on the United States, you'll see places now that 10 years from now will see a lot more increase in either rain or days over 90, days over 100, and that's going to impact health, obviously. So that's something, and that's what we're learning in Nashville, is that you can get data on climate, you can get data on weather, but it's really hard to get data on the human experience of those factors. And then the other aspect is, I'm one of these people who believe that, your zip code determines your success in life. And so therefore, when you have a city that has multiple zip codes, again, I was just talking to this mayor and he has multiple zip codes, which even within the city itself, there are different life expectancies because of the zip codes and what's in those zip codes. So I agree with you that it's something that we should and we do in sort of indirect ways. But whether you could actually, come up with the necessary metrics and the measurements over a long period of time for cities would, I think, be difficult.
Well, I'm curious, Philip. So you could do it what Gina suggests, where you do some kind of long-term study, or you could look at NEOM and see what they're instituting right away. And because you would think guys like you are involved in that, and you guys are bringing best practices to that. Are you involved in that, and you think that's happening, or it's just going to be political or grift or whatever?
I know the people in NEOM personally. I mean, I've interviewed them. We have, as a matter of fact, if you go to our Smart Cities Week, you'll see that I interviewed the CTO back in October. They're just starting. And the problem they have is they could have the best technology in the world. They don't really have anybody living there. And so what we were talking about was how could they export their technology to other cities, especially in Africa. Like, so in Africa, we have, in North America, we have 7 cities over 1 million. Africa has 40 already. And so that would be the place to extend some of these technologies and then to start learning, right? Aggregate the data, figure out, to go to Gina's question, that's where you could really do the studies, right, over a long period of time. I think they're really well-intentioned and they're well-funded. But the problem they're going to have is that if I'm a city in Africa, do I want to share my data with NEOM, right? Is that something I really want to do? Do I want them to run analytics? Do I want them to be that platform that I won't let a vendor be? So, you know, there are questions like that, and we've actually had those discussions with them. It's you know, it's like everything else with cities and life and organizations, in that we could talk now for, you know, weeks and still not really be able to get what will happen 3 years from now, because it'll be constantly changing.
Hey, one last thing from me, Philip, and I'll wrap this up, but is your organization at all taking and giving input on vendor selection or anything like that?
It's funny you should say that. Actually, not. So we're funded by solution providers and utilities and nonprofits. We actually are not a nonprofit. We're a commercial company. I'm sort of one of these Americans that believe you can do well and do good. And so and that's why I use the word scoping. We scope. So we will not get into the procurement process where we'll actually work with a city to determine whether they choose, you know, one type of sensor over another. Now in Nashville, we actually presented, with the help of the Department of Homeland Security, like 4 different types of sensors, and because they sort of span the gamut. And we did the same thing with analytics. So, but we don't get into specifications, because then that would sort of violate our trusted neutrality.
So, Phil, we're predominantly technology people here on this call, and the audience as well, I'm pretty sure. And much of what you've been telling us is really about sort of policy and planning and sort of setting up the whole sort of solving the problem, which is obviously sort of a longer term, more strategic thing. And we all know why that needs to happen with entities like cities that are so large that has lots of moving parts. So my question is, what would your advice be, assuming that there are quite a bit of similarities in terms of smart buildings and smart cities? What would your advice be to this group of people, of technologists, in terms of maneuvering ourselves to help and contribute in terms of how to manage the data that you say is critical for cities as well as buildings? Should we think about this?
Yeah, and I think, you know, just looking around the table, and you know, we have people here who seem to be very experienced. I've sold technology for many decades, and you know, as a technologist, you have to be careful, because you have to be listening to the customer as to their needs. But the area I would focus, and actually I really got some of my education here from the building sector, is the real issue going forward for cities is going to be, how do we share data? So if I'm like, we're working with Phoenix in 22 cities, we're working with San Diego in 18 cities, and their biggest issue is not about whether they use cloud or hybrid cloud, or whether they have a certain type of analytics or whatever. The real question is can they aggregate their data and then analyze it such that they can have better outcomes? And traffic is just a great example of this. Public safety is another use case around this. And so what I've really focused on for the last 2 years, and remember I said, I think the 2 levers for smart cities in the future are data and finance. I'm working on a solution for finance, but the data solution that I've been working on is, and again, I'll send the link to Anto, but you should read my article about what Virginia did with civic data trusts. And this was a data sharing approach that was, that has, and it's really not about technology. It's about governance. It's about legal agreements between parties, and it's about negotiating it, and it's about financing it. And I think there's a huge opportunity there in the smart city and smart building space, because aggregation and governance of data is, whoever holds that key controls the future.
I know we're running out of time, but I just got one more question if I could for Philip.
Sure.
I agree, Philip, I really agree with you on the data. What I question is whether the cities have I'll call it the instrumentation in place to actually get decent data. So whether it's traffic, whether it's crime, whether it's educational levels, it seems like there's no standardization, there's inadequate methodologies in place and technology in place to actually get the data that's reasonably accurate, So irrespective of who's running the politics of that community, everybody at least can go to a data source that is reliable and consistent and and you can stand behind. Do you agree with that?
Not really.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
because my experience and the example of Uber, I think, is really good here. So I had as a client one time one of the largest luxury brand automobile makers in the world. And we were talking about how they were going to protect their brand. And I threw up a slide and I said, either you ask permission or you ask forgiveness. They were always the type to ask permission. Uber was the type to ask forgiveness. And while the analogy doesn't totally work with the idea of data, because you have syntax and schemas and ontologies and taxonomies, those are going to control more what happens than not. But there are companies like Urban Loop, State of Place, Neighborlytics from Australia. Who else? There was another one. They provided street data, and people are going to use what's available. In that sense, I think they're going to follow the consumer experience. What is available? Somebody mentioned UX, earlier, the digital journey, and whatever becomes easiest to use without violating cybersecurity and other types of, and that's why data governance is important, I think will rule the roost. I don't think they're going to wait for standards. I don't think they're going to wait for somebody to tell them this is sort of the way to do it. And so I mean, I think your question is right on, but if you wait for any of that to happen, you'll probably lose your market share.
Yeah, I'm not talking about so much waiting as I'm just wondering if good information's already available and people know where to go get it.
Well, the answer to that is no. I mean,
yeah, okay.
And mostly because they just don't have access, and they may have their own legacy data system with some analytics and some reporting and their own dashboards, but they can't access. So like Mesa, Arizona can't access certain really key data out of Phoenix or, or other places. And so the question is really, is they don't have access, and that's why data sharing is needed. But and there's an opportunity there, right? Whoever can come along, and I think anybody who has experience in buildings with integrating data will understand how to do it with cities.
All right, so with that, I think we need to bring this to a wrap. This has been a great conversation. Thank you very much, Philip, for joining us. It's been a great perspective. Video of this will be up by tomorrow morning, and we will be back next week, continuing our sustainability conversation. We will have Jim Young from Realcomm joining us as a guest. So that will be an interesting conversation to see what's going on in his world. So with that, thank you all, and bye-bye. Have a great week.
Thank you for your time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Phil.